So we have with us, starting this session, this Isabel Pina is a PhD student in historical musicology with a doctoral fellowship in Portugal, Lisbon. Mainly interests Portuguese history of music in the 19th and 20th century. Music and ideology, nationalism, neoclassicism, analysis and semiotics of music, etc. Isabel finished her master's in musicology, historical musicology, in music criticism and nationalism and Latinism. Luis de Freitas Franco between the decades of 1910 and 1930. So Isabel is going to talk about ironic symbolism in times of solemn neoclassicism, as if I am not wrong, is the title of your presentation.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to share my screen and sound now. Let me see. Can you all see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
So I'd like to start just thanking the organization for letting me be the first to present. Unfortunately, I'm not there because I have another conference here in Lisbon, which I'm also organizing. And soon after my presentation, I'll have to leave, unfortunately, because I'll present here in Lisbon as well. So I'm very sorry for not being there, but luckily I can present for you at the same. So I'm going to start. If at any point you don't hear me or you don't hear my music examples, please just tell me and I'll check if everything is okay. So Luís de Freitas Branco occupies an unquestionable place in the historiography of Portuguese music. Mentioned in life and posthumously not only as a composer but also as a critic, chronicler, lecturer, musicologist and teacher, he seems to be one of the most studied musical figures of the 20th century in Portugal. However, the multiplicity of his activity and the complexity of many of the themes that were dear to him still trigger new approaches and investigations. In my PhD thesis, I explored his activity as a pedagogue, along with his musical creations and journalistic writings, also discussing the social circles in which he used to move. The intention was to understand his effective influence on the following generations, starting from two composers from different generations and learning contexts, Fernando Lopes Graça and Jolie Braga Santos. Each of the disciples sees the master and his presence in a particular way. In a spectrum from rejection to total identification, nuances that are perceptible in the private and public writings of these characters and in their music with different dynamics and motivations. In this presentation, I will focus on Lopes Graça, also a prolific composer and music critic, known for antagonizing the dictatorship's guidelines and who was Freitas Branco's student in the late 1920s and 30s. During these decades and later, Luís Freitas Branco combined his characteristic systematic interpretation of history, which he defended publicly and repeatedly, with an unshakable conviction that, in the Portuguese national context, musical progress implied a reappreciation and rapprochement of the symphonic genre. Since the symphony, however, was not necessarily abandoned in the transition to modernism or throughout the 20th century, Luís Freitas Branco's vision of what the return to symphonic music should be was far from what was happening all over Europe. The awakening of modernity is, above all, a tension between an undeniable and praiseworthy past and a necessarily different future. And if it is legitimate for us to generalize any aspect about 20th century symphony, the most common tendency seems to be not an abandonment of the genre as a possible reaction to Romanticism, but an exploration or perhaps ironic questioning of the symphony in the combination of more distant references, namely the Baroque period, of new compositional techniques, or even of other contemporary music, such as folklore, film music, or popular music. From the end of the 19th century onwards, the canonical form of the symphony was repeatedly compromised. In Mahler or Sibelius, deconstructing the genre with the suppression or fusion of movements. In Milhaud's miniatures, with the questioning of the symphony's grandeur and cohesion. in Prokofiev, Stravinsky, and Hindemith, with a fascination with Baroque references that wasn't totally incompatible with the successive attempts to revive the classical symphony. Luís Freitas Branco seemed to struggle with precisely the same issues, but we are also fundamentally facing a revisitation of past aesthetics for the ultimate creation of a national symphonic music. In this sense, contrary to the German context, in which the general inclination is based on the reinterpretation of the symphony as it had been established during German Romanticism, in the Portuguese context, in the somewhat isolated example of Freitas Branco, we witnessed the late implantation of the genre, serving a nationalist symphonic ideology not grounded in national history. The inexistence of a Portuguese symphonic tradition seems, therefore, to have motivated Freitas Branco to definitely create it, an undertaking that was associated with the composer's turn to neoclassicism. However, as Scott Messing mentions in the preface to Neoclassicism in Music, the term is indiscriminately used in criticism and in musicological studies, referring to disparate currents, aesthetics, and techniques, and raising paradoxes, in the most general sense of the term, related to the concepts of clarity, simplicity, objectivity, purity, refinement, constructive logic, concision, sobriety, precisely the terms that Freitas Branco used over and over again to justify his works from the 1920s onwards. Neoclassicism is also used to mention musical works from the 20th century that, quote, borrow from or model on or allude to a work or composer from an earlier era, often from the 18th century, but equally from any composition regardless of period that has somehow entered into the canon of great art, end of quote. In this sense, Luís Freitas Branco also seems to fit into the vast catalogue of neoclassical composers, with his return to classical forms, the study and reuse of medieval and Renaissance references, and his dedication to the great genres and geniuses of the Western musical canon. However, if neoclassicism was for the first time consciously used in France to elevate a classical national tradition as opposed to German Romanticism, it also seemed to be used as statement by many. Schoenberg claimed to be the logical follower of German geniuses, using references to the past and new compositional techniques. Thus, a concept that is closely related to nationalist current as an individual affirmation of belonging to a certain genealogy seems to encompass both Stravinsky's detachment from romantic sentimentality, the frivolity of Les Six, Schoenberg's dodecaphonism, and to a certain extent, the symphony of Luís Freitas Branco. His disciple, Fernando Lopes Graça, however, seemed to disagree with the symphonic thinking, criticizing what he considered a setback in his master's work, as well as with other so-called neoclassical aesthetics. Fernando Lopes Graça finished his symphony in 1944, giving it the quasi-pleonastic title Sinfonia per Orchestra, perhaps an approximation to Bela Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra, with which Lopes Graça's symphony shares the inclusion of an intermezzo and the last movement in Perpetuum mobile. Sinfonia per Orchestra was composed for a national composition competition, and with this work, Fernando Lopes Graça was awarded the first prize for the third time. Apart from the title, which surprises us by what seems at first glance to be a statement of the obvious, the symphony is by itself different from the works commonly inscribed in the typology. It is a symphony in 3 movements, organized in fast, slow, and fast movements, almost suggesting the Italian overture of the 18th century, and not necessarily the typical classical romantic symphony. In this sense, the redundancy ceases to be, since the clarification about the orchestra may evoke an older etymology that may question the Germanic conception of symphonic construction and go back to the Italian operatic origins of the genre, perhaps criticizing the Latinist thesis of Luís Freitas Branco. As a matter of fact, whose symphonism was much more defined by Germanic references. The first movement, Allegro Rhapsodico, deliberately contradicts the usual sonata form that characterizes the first movement of the symphony. So now I'm going to show you the first seconds of the symphony, the first movement. So please tell me if you can hear this. Let me just press play at some point. I'm hoping it works. I guess, but it's in the wrong minute. Sorry. Did you hear it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Start over this, okay. So, although there are returns throughout the movement, there is no consummation of a re-exposition, as Fernando Lopes Graça proposes to explore various melodies and elements, rather than contrast, develop, and return to the listener to obvious themes. An extensive use of counterpoint characterizes this movement, with the forgato writing and dialogues between instruments, thus exploring the timbre of each instrument or group of instruments. The strong rhythm, alternation of irregular measures, Stravinskian accentuations, and inconclusive or abrupt cadences, already present in much of Fernando Lopes Graça's production, contribute to a feeling of no development. In other words, the composer does not extend the themes, leaving them sometimes completely abandoned. Another contradiction of Luís Freitas Branco, who was sometimes negatively criticized for prolonging, developing, repeating too much in his symphonies. Fernando Lopes Graça calls the second movement intermezzo, thus implying the insertion of something perhaps unrelated to the movements that precede and succeeded, in part in the logic of the opera intermezzo, in the context in which another totally different work was included between acts. So I'm going to play some tiny bit of the beginning of the second movement. The others facing yet another subversion of the genre, despite once again the alternation between two contrasting themes or environments. Due to the chosen scales and harmony, the timbre of the English horn and other reeds, the rhythm, accentuations, articulations, the use of certain percussions such as castanets, this environment reminds us of some sort of Carmen or Dance of the Seven Veils, or even an excerpt of Luís de Freitas Branco's Vatek, a symphonic poem from Lopes Graça's master, from 1914. And I'm going to play just a tiny bit of this symphonic poem. Oh, not this one. I'm sorry. Sorry, the internet here is really slow today. I don't know what's happening, but at least it's working. Yes. So this was British Branco symphonic poem. So these references may or may not be purposeful, and the latter possibly being related to Fernando Lopes Graça's clear admiration for Luís Freitas Branco in his youth. Perhaps thus criticizing, through the composition of the symphony, precisely these metamorphoses of Freitas Branco into an obsolete symphonism. In other words, Lopes Graça admired the youthful impulses of Freitas Branco, placing him in the vanguard of musical modernization in Portugal at the beginning of the 20th century. Regarding the second movement of the symphony, it seems to match its designation. It is profoundly different from the other two, thus breaking the belief in the cyclical form, which, according to some historiography, is also defended and composed by Luís Freitas Branco and some disciples as a unifying characteristic within the musical work. In the third movement, Fernando Lopes Graça clearly replaces the classic minuet with the introduction of a passacaglia, a typically Baroque dance genre common in several neoclassicisms, neo-Baroques, and returns to Bach throughout Europe, especially from Brahms onwards. From Brahms, Lopes Graça seems to use the fourth symphony's conception of the dance movement. Also a passacaglia, the last movement of Brahms' fourth symphony is a notorious case of the romantic appropriation of Baroque elements. Fernando Lopes Graça follows this model, obeying the typical conception of a passacaglia as a theme and variations, not going back to the beginning, transforming the theme, according to some authors, the only one in the work of traditional origin, to the point of deconstructing it to the threshold of perceptibility. And I'm going to show you the last movement. It's the last musical example I'm going to show you. So, in its contemporary and later reception in musicological studies, some of these dimensions were suggested, namely some of the possible references, Bartók and Stravinsky. Later, by Teresa Cascudo, the symphony, like other works by Lopes Graça, was considered an example of the subversion of musical forms and genres as an impetus and desire for modernity by Lopes Graça. While by Alexandre Delgado, the work is considered a continuation of the legacy of Luís Freitas Branco. However, the work can be perceived in a different way. Subversion of form and genre, however, aiming to subvert the learning with the master, still worthy of respect, but necessary to contradict in some point of view. For Lopes Graça, Luís Freitas Branco, in his vision of an unavoidable return to a classical-based and supposedly Latin and national symphony, should be questioned, as it was sometimes done by this disciple both in private and public contexts. Through a caricatural interpretation of Freitas Branco's own philosophy, ironizing in this sense the return to Baroque style to meet true symbolism, and using popular music in an approach to a perhaps more logical inspiration for the creation of national music. In other words, Lopes Garça seems to have used irony as a figure of speech in which words have a meaning that diverges from their official meaning. From this point of view, the official meaning of a symphony, in its most crystallized context, would be a work usually in 4 movements, some, the first and the last, composed in sonata form, an intermediate slow movement and a dance movement, and, in the conception of Freitas Branco, a work with cyclical themes. Fernando Lopes Garça builds a deliberate but subtly different version of the 19th century notion of symphony. While maintaining the slow movement and the dance movement, he plays with the literal and previous meaning of the genre. This game is achieved through the apparent pleonasm with which he emphasizes the orchestral context of the work and resulting to stylistic mechanisms closer to the genre in its origin. Thus, this fluctuation of musical conventions is materialized in the paradox that seems to define irony itself, that is, a dimension deeply related to the individual intentions of those who perform it, who want their intention to be perceived by some and not by others. This is how Fernando Lopes Garça seems to have assumed his individuality between the jury that awarded him the first prize and before the public, considering his own convictions about the artist's identity and individuality despite his learning influences. With this singular work, he did not compose any symphonies again. Fernando Lopes Garça tests his own hypothesis, launched precisely in the same year in his book, A Música Portuguesa e os seus Problemas, or Portuguese Music and Its Problems. In this text, Lopes Garça questioned if the symphony could perhaps become a creative option for building a national musical language, given a lack of competence for the operatic genre in most Portuguese composers. Basically, perhaps through his own reflection on his experience as a composer of symphonic works, precisely in response to why he would not have continued to compose in the genre, he ends up once again desacralizing the symphony, thus removing the importance it seemed to occupy in the Western musical canon, while he briefly mentions the difficulty of classifying his work as a true symphony, that is, recognizing and spreading his non-identification with the current thought. And quoting him, and a question, why haven't you already given a partner to your first symphony? Because it didn't happen, and because I don't have the fascination, not to say the superstition of a symphony as the noblest form among all. And by the way, I remember a jolly fact. Some national critics did not consider my first symphony to be a true symphony, because it developed little. An illustrious foreign musical eminent figure considered it a huge symphony, because it developed too much. Effects of latitude or optics. End of quote. Although not necessarily anti-romantic, since he denied this categorization, Lopes Garça may be included in the lineage of those who question the authority of romanticism and classical romantic language. And perhaps what is seen and analyzed here as irony can be a descent with the immediate past a la Stravinsky, and above all with the present a la Freitas Branco. And here, therefore, a critique of Freitas Branco's actually very romantic neoclassicism is evident. Namely, in the Baroquism perceptible in the disciples' work, much closer to the anti-romantic reactions or neoclassical ideas present in the history of music since the beginning of the 20th century. Perhaps in a reinterpretation of the Debussy's idea that the symphony would have crystallized into obsolete formulas, and like Bartók in his Concerto for Orchestra, which resorts much more to pre-classical and pre-romantic context of the genre and alters the common organic of the movements of a concert, returning it to the Concerto Grosso, Lopes Garça questions stable models, like he did in all the activities he carried out at the time, over decades of action in the Portuguese cultural context. Sinfonia per Orchestra was the only work entitled Symphony to be completed. However, undated sketches for Second Symphony have been identified by Teresa Cascudo, as well as sketches later identified as belonging to a symphony with non-concertante piano and a symphony dedicated to a friend. The fact that some of these parts were written and later abandoned leads us to question whether the relevance of the symphony might have been a topic of internal debate for Fernando Lopes Garça, alternately believing and disbelieving in the adequacy of the genre in a modern era. Thank you very much for your attention.
Does anybody have questions? Yeah, I think there's one question for you, Isabel.
Yes, I'm hearing you really, really.
I think we have one question for you.
Okay, okay, thank you. Now I'm
You
here.
know, you can see.
Okay.
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
I wondered if you had considered Hindemith as a possible inspiration with the Pasacaglia for the last movement.
Yes, I thought about that, and I explored it a little bit in my PhD thesis. So when I made this proposal for this conference, I was in the middle of writing the PhD thesis, and now I'm waiting for the public defense of it. That will be in a month from today. So yes, I explored some references to Bartók, Stravinsky, Hindemith, and Hindemith makes a lot of sense because Fernando Lopes de Graça has a huge admiration for Hindemith. So it is completely appropriate to elaborate on that.
The Neue
Thank you.
Sachlichkeit.
Sorry?
The Neue Sachlichkeit.
Yes. It makes sense.
Alternative
Totally.
to Stravinsky and neoclassicism.
Okay. Yeah, that makes total sense. Fernando Lopes de Graça is quite a difficult composer to understand because he didn't like any labels, you know. So he's known for criticizing everything. So when some people even talking to him adverted that it seemed really close to certain composers, he always said like, yes, I know them and I admire them, but I refuse to be part of that label. So yeah, but Neue Sachlichkeit is obviously at some point in some of his work is evidently present. Thank you.
Thank you for introducing us to that beautiful work.
Thank you. I hope you can maybe hear it in the full symphony because it's really interesting and it's completely available on YouTube. And yeah, so Lopes de Graça is mostly people know him for the choir works, and most of them are revolutionary songs that were sung during the dictatorship and that were hidden and sang like in secret corporations against the dictatorship, but he was also a really prolific orchestral composer. So I'm really glad to show you this part of his career. Thank you.
Any more questions? Look, there's no more questions. So thank you very much, Isabel.
I'm sorry for leaving now, but I will be back tomorrow to listen to other colleagues presenting, but now I have to go to my own conference, so it's been a mess. I don't know how these things end up at the same time, but yeah, stuff happens. So thank you very, very much for letting me present this, and I hope you enjoy Barcelona as I would love to.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.